Last Thursday, we were honored to welcome the award-winning journalist and author Yardena Schwartz to Temple Beth Shalom, and thank you again to Laura Greif and the Heritage Center, as well as Robert Judovitz and Rebecca Zarabi of the Israel Committee for making that event such a success. Yardena is the author of a brand new book called Ghosts of a Holy War, which tells the story of the 1929 massacre of the Jews of Hebron, one of the most sacred and venerated cities in the world for both Jews and Muslims. Hebron is the location of the Marat HaMachpelah, the cave of the patriarchs, the burial place of Abraham and Sarah, Isaac and Rebekah, and Jacob and Leah. And each year, thousands of Jews make pilgrimage to the city of Hebron on this Shabbat, the Shabbat during which we read Chayei Sarah. Because in Parshat Chayei Sarah, this week's Torah portion, we read the story of Abraham buying the plot of land in Hebron, which becomes the burial site for his family, the matriarchs and patriarchs of the Jewish people. And in this week's Torah portion, we also read of the death of not only Sarah, but of Abraham as well. And there is a beautiful and very important verse about Abraham's funeral that I want to draw your attention to. It's a verse that doesn't seem particularly significant, but really it is profoundly important. Vayamot Avraham b'seva tova, and Abraham died at a good, ripe old age. Vayikberu oto Yitzchak ve'Ishmael banav, and his sons Isaac and Ishmael buried him together. Isaac and Ishmael did not have a simple or an easy relationship. Remember, Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn child, was the son of his concubine Hagar. Sarah, Abraham's wife, gave Abraham permission to have a child with Hagar, her maidservant, after she had struggled with infertility for decades. But at the age of 90, Sarah miraculously became pregnant with Yitzchak, with Isaac, and she gave birth to him. And because of that difficult situation, from the very outset, Isaac and Ishmael's relationship was one defined by jealousy, by competition, by tension. The Torah tells us that after Yitzchak was born, Sarah demands that Abraham banish Hagar and Ishmael from their home, and Abraham reluctantly acquiesces. He sends Hagar and Ishmael out into the wilderness, presumably to their deaths, although miraculously they both survive. But as far as we know, Isaac and Ishmael don't see each other again for decades. The first time the Torah mentions them being together again is at their father's funeral. And the rabbis of the Talmud offer a beautiful piece of insight into Isaac and Ishmael's reunion at Abraham's funeral. In a midrash in the Talmud, the rabbis teach that before Ishmael buried his father, he did tshuva. He reflected and he repented, and ultimately he decided to return to his brother Yitzchak. Whatever work needed to be done to mend the rift, to bury the hatchet, Isaac and Ishmael did that work so that they could stand side by side and bury their father together. In other words, Ishmael, the ancestor of Islam, and Yitzchak, the ancestor of Judaism, were able to set aside their differences and acknowledge that at the end of the day, they were brothers. They had much, much more in common with one another than they had differences with one another. And the fact that Abraham is buried in Hebron is precisely why Hebron is a holy site not only for Jews, but for Muslims as well. Because, of course, Abraham is not only the patriarch of the Jewish people, he is also the father of Ishmael, the ancestor of Islam. Both Jews and Muslims conceive of themselves as the children of Abraham. And for centuries, Jews and Muslims lived peacefully side by side in the city of Hebron. They were neighbors. They were friends. They knew each other by name. Until the year 1929, when the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini, began circulating false claims that the Jews were planning on destroying the Al-Aqsa Mosque in order to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. False claims which led to the terrible massacre of the Jews of Hebron. As Yardena Schwartz told us last Thursday, on the morning of August 24th, 1929, 3,000 Muslim men armed with daggers and axes and swords marched through the ancient Jewish quarter of Hebron. And they went from house to house and did terrible, terrible, unspeakable things that I'm not going to mention from the Bima because we have children here this morning. And they were indiscriminate in the violence. They didn't distinguish between men, women, and children. They killed every Jewish person that they could. And the saddest part is many of the Jewish victims knew their attackers well. They knew them by name because they were their neighbors and their landlords and even their friends, which is why the Jews of Hebron never believed that something like that could happen in their city. And looking back now, that massacre in Hebron in 1929 was such a chilling and haunting predictor of what was to come nearly 100 years later on October 7th. But in the midst of all the horror and the carnage, heroes emerged. Nearly 24 Muslim men and women risked their lives on that day to save their Jewish neighbors and friends in 1929. At least 250 Jews were saved that day because of Muslim heroes. And of course, we all now know that that same thing happened on October 7th, when dozens of Bedouins risked their lives to save Jews. Omar Abu Sabila was in Sderot on October 7th when the terrorists invaded the city, and he was shot early on that morning during the attack. And moments after he was shot, he heard a woman screaming from a nearby car, and he saw that in that car there was a Jewish woman with two young girls, just 6 and 3 years old. And somehow he managed to crawl over to the car. He got them out. He brought them to safety to the nearest police station, and that's where he succumbed to his wounds. And last year, his brother, Omar Sabila's brother, received a posthumous award on his behalf in honor of his heroism and his bravery. Yusef Zidana, a bus driver from the southern city of Rachat, saved the lives of at least 30 Jewish Israelis at the Nova Music Festival when he risked his life by driving his minibus directly into the carnage to rescue as many people as he possibly could. He crammed 30 young Israelis into his 14-seat minibus, and he sped away as he literally was dodging bullets being fired by Hamas terrorists. And of course, the famous hostage Farhan al-Qadi, who was kidnapped by Hamas terrorists on October 7th at Kibbutz Magen after he refused to tell the terrorists where the Jews on the kibbutz were hiding. Thankfully, he was rescued by the IDF this past summer after he was held in captivity for 326 days. The Muslim heroes of both October 7th and of 1929 remembered that lesson from this week's Torah portion that Isaac and Ishmael taught us. Yes, Jews and Muslims have a very difficult, a very complicated, and a very painful history. But at the end of the day, as Yitzchak and Ishmael remind us, we are all children of Abraham. There is so much more that should unite us than should divide us. And reconciliation can only begin when we see past those differences and we remember our shared origin, when we remember that we too are capable of standing side by side. And we hope and we pray that someday, very soon, like Yitzchak and Ishmael, we will be able to stand side by side as brothers. Shabbat Shalom.